we go, everybody. So over the course of the next half an hour, 40 minutes, we'll aim to cover this agenda and provide you with a lot of information with regards to 3D ghosting, what it is, a practical guide that we use to help diagnose 3D ghosting in the field and help exhibitors and integrators understand where the root cause of 3D ghosting may be coming from. Matt will also share with you a case study from a few months ago with an exhibitor in the field where we helped to diagnose the cause of 3D ghosting. We'll also give you some advice that's been given to us from our partners and colleagues in distribution about how to raise awareness if you believe that the issue is regarding content. And finally, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask any questions of Matt and myself. And before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll try and keep the web seminar as short as possible because we know that you're extremely busy. If you do have any issues with audio, pictures or anything else during the webinar, please do use the chat box, which is positioned at the bottom right hand side of your panel. We've also have the ability for you to post some questions to us in the Q&A section of today's agenda. You can do that again using the tool. We are recording the session today, so if for any reason you have to leave or you'd like to share this with a colleague or review it at a later date, you'll be able to do so via the Harkness website, and we'll send out a link to the URL in due course. So to kick us off, what we'd like to do is to just open up the floor and ask you a couple of questions with regards to your own personal experiences of 3D ghosting to really understand whether or not this is something you've experienced and what form it might take. So on the screen in a few seconds you'll see a poll appear, and you can interact with the screen by clicking on the answers of your choice. So on screen right now is a poll. Have you experienced 3D ghosting in your cinema? So please select either yes or no if you're an exhibitor, or NA if you're a partner from anywhere else within the industry, or you've never experienced it, or it's not something that you typically would look for. Okay, that's great. We'll leave that just for a few more seconds as I can still see some of the votes coming in. Thank you very much for that. And now our second question is regarding the cause. And so what do you believe to be the common causes of 3D crosstalk? Is it content, projection, 3D polarizing units, the screen, or others? Again, we'll leave that up for just a few more seconds for the last few clicks to come through. That's great, thank you. What we'll do is we'll share the results of those two questions with you now, so you can hopefully gauge your fellow colleagues joining us this afternoon and whether or not they're experiencing similar issues to yourself. So up on screen now you can see the results of the first poll. 77% of you are saying that you have experienced 3D ghosting, 17% not applicable, and just 6% saying no, you've never experienced 3D ghosting. So if you have experienced it and you're in that 77%, you're definitely not alone. And the second question was, what do you believe to be the cause of 3D ghosting? Well, up on screen you can see that 3D polarizer is actually the number one choice at 42%, content at 31%, the screen at 15%, projection at 8%, and others at 3%. So actually a very interesting mix of answers there, and it does show some of the issues that you can face in trying to diagnose where the root cause of 3D crosstalk may well have come from. So thank you very much for your participation in those two questions. What I'm now going to do is hand over to Matt, who's sat very quietly and patiently alongside me, and Matt's going to talk to you about 3D ghosting and a little bit about the processes we've been using to help exhibitors and integrators diagnose the cause of 3D ghosting. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. So first of all, 3D, as we know, can be very good for our cinemas, particularly if you've got the right type of movie content that lends itself to 3D. You know, this gives a benefit to your customers. It's something we can all work with. It looks good. However, bad 3D is not good for our industry, and there are lots of incidences for lots of different reasons why 3D isn't looking as what it should do. So it's very important that we do our best as an industry to, make this as correct as we can. First of all then, what is 3D ghosting? In most simplistic terms for identifying it on your screen, it's essentially when imagery meant for one eye intrudes upon the other. So if you look at the image in the bottom left of the screen, you can see the ghost on the image, the shimmering at the side, a double image. Often it's seen as a double or triple image. So the 78% of you from the poll clearly know what I'm talking about. So this is what we're up against. Now I find it's most commonly seen in certainly high contrast scenes and subtitles, also with high brightness. So for example, if 3D movies are shown at very high foot lamberts, perhaps more than they're mastered to be shown at, this again can introduce ghosting. So it's seen in these types of situations, and most likely seen with polarized 3D. And I won't go too much into the background of this, but this is more a diagnosis presentation. So when you talk about diagnosis, what do I mean? When I work in the field and I work with integrators, exhibitors, engineers, I sometimes see diagnosis not necessarily done in the correct way. To me, it's something that needs to be a very structured process. We can't just pluck ideas out of the air and hope we can find out what the problem. And sometimes I see what I call tunnel vision. So you may have someone's read a magazine article, or they've spoken to a colleague in another cinema, and someone said, oh, I had 3D ghosting, or it could be any other problem, of course, and they say it was X. And of course, certain people then latch on to this and decide all of the problems because of what their colleagues heard. So we have to try and avoid this, and although what you've heard may well be right, you need to systematically prove it. So the final point there is a phrase I like to use, a systematic process of elimination. So it means a step-by-step process going through the various components of the chain and step-by-step eliminating them one at a time until we find out the most likely culprit of what's causing the problem. So it's as I say, it's a very structured process. Now the scope of the problem. I think when we're diagnosing a problem in a cinema, it's all too easy to say, I've got 3D ghosting in auditorium 3, and all you do is go straight into auditorium 3 and perhaps blindly looking at what may or may not be the problem. Now, of course, we have to look at auditorium 3, that's where the problem's been reported, but I like to assess the scope of the problem and see, is it a wider problem? So if it's a cinema where maybe we have 3 or 4 3D auditoriums, I would of course view the local content that the customer's perhaps complaining, so a certain movie they've seen and they've noticed ghosting. I'll look at it in that auditorium, but then I will take the same DCP and go to the other 3D auditoriums in that cinema and have a look at the problem. Is that problem still occurring? Now, if it isn't occurring, of course, we've called it a local problem to that one auditorium, but if it is a problem where it's ghosting in the other auditoriums as well, then it's likely to be a more general issue, so not such a local one. And this could be something like movie content where the same DCPs are being played, or for example, particularly if it's a new build or a new installation, it could be software settings that are general to all of the auditorium. You know, the same settings have been typed in. So we're trying to diagnose are these common faults or local faults. So once we know that, we know which avenue to progress on. Obviously, being screen manufacturers, we like to have a look, is it the screen surface itself? Now, of course, with Polarized 3D, if a silver screen had an extreme failure, so we're talking like a manufacturing failure where the coating's broken down, this could cause loss of polarization. It could cause ghosting. I have to say it's very unlikely, and I genuinely, in my 5 years at Harkness, I've not seen this happening on a Harkness screen. That said, it's something that's very easy to test. Of course, I'm sure any screen manufacturer would say if their screen was deemed to be a problem, they'd simply replace it. So the easiest thing is to actually test this. So one thing we would do, certainly to Harkness customers, or even if you're not a Harkness customer, I'd like to say, you know, come and talk to us, and we would suggest using something like a 1 metre by 2 metre test sample of screen. This can be sent to the site, and this will be a proven silver screen which we know is working correctly, and this can then be offered up in front of the movie that you've got a problem with, and you can then very easily see, is the ghosting, obviously it's present on the main cinema screen on the frame, but is the ghosting now showing on the screen that we're offering up in front? So you could hold up this screen over a section of ghosting area. If the test screen that we're holding up is not ghosting, then you very quickly prove that there must be something wrong with the screen itself. Of course, if the ghosting is still prevalent on the test screen, then we know it's something that's not the screen. So for example, it could be something wrong with the projector, the movie content, some of the other things I'm going to talk about. So very easy to rule out or rule in, of course, but that's a test we would advise you doing. The port glass. Now, particularly when 3D first came out, there was a lot of situations where certain port glasses were being used that were causing internal reflections, and I remember looking at a lot of cases back at this time, and certainly in some territories where we have to use fire retardant port glass, this was particularly a problem. So it's a very easy test to do in most installations, not all of course, but in many cinemas it's actually not too difficult to physically remove the port glass. So if you're having a ghosting problem, you know, have a look at the image, remove the port glass itself, leaving the image still running, and it has the ghosting disappeared. Very simple test to do, so a very simple case of elimination. So that's the port glass itself. The 3D system, of course, this gets a little bit more complicated. There's lots of settings on a 3D system. These will vary between different types of 3D systems, but there's ways to work through this. But starting at the most easiest part of the 3D system, the eyewear. Very easy to go in there and be diagnosing a problem, and I've come across this personally where there was a ghosting problem and everything had been tested. We assumed, you know, all the settings were correct on the 3D system. However, in this particular case, it turned out to be the eyewear. Now again, it's not a common situation, but there was a case where there was a faulty batch of eyewear. So it was literally a whole box of certain eyewear that was out in the field causing a problem. So it took a while, but it's very easy once you know with hindsight to just keep with you a known good set of eyewear, a set you've used in one of your other cinemas, keep that in your engineer's kit. So when you come to a cinema with a ghosting problem, you can of course test with the eyewear present at the cinema, but also if it's still ghosting, take out your own eyewear, the one you know works, look through those, is the ghosting still there? So that's very, very easy to rule out. Now the software settings I mentioned is lots of different things. I've given 3 examples here. The multiplication, so is it flashing correctly? Dark time settings, of course these vary with different 3D systems, and that can make a difference to any ghost. Polarity of the image itself, if it's completely projecting in the wrong polarity. So these are some of those settings. So what I would suggest in the case of software settings, unless you're an integrator that's very, very familiar with this particular 3D system you're working on, it's probably worthwhile contacting the actual 3D provider. And certainly the technical staff at all the 3D companies are usually very helpful in this regard and will give you a lot of information to help you check all of the different software settings. So that's the actual software side of things. Of course, we have different types of polarized 3D settings. The most straightforward ones are the standard sort of crystal Z screens, But of course we now have high brightness, high light efficiency factor multi-beam systems. Again, these are very good systems, but there's additional elements of alignment. You're actually having to line up multi-beams, and again, if these are done incorrectly, this can cause more ghosting than one would normally expect. So again, check on the line-up test patterns. There'll be different processes with different manufacturers. Again, check with the manufacturer how best to do this if you're not sure. And the final point is test with a replacement 3D unit. Now, not every cinema or engineer team is necessarily going to be able to do that, but if you do have a replacement unit, you can very quickly just substitute it. Such an easy test to do. You know, if you haven't got one and the cinema's shut for a certain amount of hours, if you've got competent engineers on site, you could take a good 3D system that's working in one of your other screens and move it to the problem screen and see if the problem disappears. If it does, then you know it could be something to do with that 3D system. So again, it's this systematic process of elimination. We're all one piece out at a time. Is it linked to movie content? There has been a lot of talk about this at the moment, and I have seen a lot of this myself. So occasionally we get times with certain movies where the content appears not to have been correctly mastered for Polarized 3D. So we have other content working fine, but certain movies are not. So this is something, again, you need to test with. So I would test with what I would call known good content if you have this. So begin, of course, looking at the content which the problem's been reported at, so you can gauge the problem, which I mentioned in the slide, talking about the scope. But then bring in other content. So if you have known good content that you know doesn't ghost, could be from another screen, could be something you ingest yourself, try this. You know, try different bits of content. If you do diagnose it that one particular feature is ghosting, if you've seen this, then bring out the known good content or try other content you've got, even if you know it's not good. Are these ghosting as well? If they're not, it might point to something wrong with a certain DCP. The final point there talks about Foot-Lambert brightness levels. Now, a lot of the industry is talking about high brightness 3D. I understand that, and a lot of special events, trade shows, etc. Certain DCPs are mastered specifically for high foot Lamberts, 10 foot Lamberts, 14 foot Lamberts. But DCPs typically mastered for regular cinema are not going to be mastered at those levels typically. They're normally mastered around 3.5 to 4.5 foot Lamberts in that sort of region. Now, of course, if you're projecting onto those sorts of DCPs, but rather than 3.5 to 4.5 foot Lamberts, you're putting 8 foot Lamberts, 10 foot Lamberts, 14 foot Lamberts, ghosting, which would not normally be visible under the normal light brightness levels, will now become visible. So there may not be anything wrong with the DCP, so to speak, but it's a case of you've now introduced something by projecting on very high brightness. So this is something to be aware of as well. And of course, the other point of projecting at very high brightness, although you can introduce ghosting, in general, if it's not mastered for those high levels, you're going to wash out the colours, you can affect contrast. There's other problems that can be introduced. So do be aware of that one as well. Not everybody thinks of that. Richard mentioned we were going to talk about a field case study. Now, I could list many of these. This is just one particular example that I worked on at the end of last year. And this was one where I visited a cinema. There was a complaint about ghosting, and I wanted to rule out, was it the screen first of all, and of course help the customer diagnose the problem. So the image you can see on the screen is where we use a test screen that I mentioned in the previous slide, where we held up a section of screen. Again, this could be your cinema where we sent you a test screen. And you can see on the image, we've taken a photograph through a camera, through an eyewear lens, and we've rotated it slightly, which changed the colour of the ghost. So you can see the main image in this particular movie content is white. It's a white light. And the ghost is the pink image to the left, because we were going through the left eye of the glass. Now you can see very clearly on the main image in the background, the ghosting is very, very clear. And then if you look in the bottom left-hand corner and you look at the test screen being held up by two colleagues, you can see the ghost is equally prevalent on the test screen. So in this case here, it proved the screen itself wasn't causing the issue and it was something else. So we essentially followed the above procedure. The customer checked the porthole glass, they'd checked the 3D settings, projector settings, this type of thing. And in the end, it was determined that it might be the actual movie content itself. So a very easy test to do when we got to the end of the chain. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we looked at other movie content. So there was about 3 different other 3D films we looked at. There was an animated one, there was quite a shallow depth movie, and there was a regular 3D movie. So it's nice to try different types of content as well. And all of the other movies had beautiful 3D, looked fantastic. So this was something that in this case was this one particular movie itself. So, you know, once you get to the problem, if you do think it is the DCP content, do prove it. And it's the same with any of the points I've made. You may get in your fault finding, your systematic process may point to a certain element that's causing the problem, but then prove it and double check it. It's so easy to miss this point. So once you've diagnosed it, what do you do? This is pretty much straightforward. So if it's an equipment problem, you know, again, it's a rare occurrence, but say it was a screen, you can talk to your screen provider. If it's a problem with projector software settings or 3D system software settings and you think these need changing, you know, all of our industry partners are, you know, tend to be very friendly people, always willing to help the end user, which is great. So do talk to these guys and they will help you get around the problem with their individual piece of equipment. The same thing if you think it's movie content, you know, do contact the distributor. You know, I'm sure they'll be only too pleased to help you in this case and try and isolate the problem. So if you need to escalate that problem with a distributor, a lot of people aren't sure how to do this. So typically we'd suggest contact the distributor through the booking department, you know, your usual communication channel. They'll be pleased to help you. They may not be the guys to actually diagnose the issue, of course, and they'll be happy to, you know, pass this over to technical departments and they can isolate the problem. Might be production departments as well. Of course, distributors in this case will have a visibility globally, so they'll be able to look, is this a problem just happening in your territory, or is it just in your cinema, or is it a bigger situation? Same thing with equipment manufacturers as well. You know, we can all look globally and see what's happening. You know, and if it does lead to content, the distributor will help you to find a remedy for that. So in conclusion, and I can't stress this point so much, it is a rigorous test, but it's got to be structured. You know, I've seen so many cases where customers have tunnel visioned onto one particular problem that might be the wrong problem, and then they're showing 3D ghosting, which might be quite easy to fix for 2, 3, 4 weeks when they don't need to be. So, you know, a structured manner avoids this and helps us all, you know, remedy the problem as quick as we can. Check different 3D content known to be good. Again, so important. If you're only testing on one bit of content that you deem you have the problem, you know, you can't then rule out that content, so try different content. Again, it's substitution, it's this process of elimination. And again, if you decide it's the DCP, you know, don't sit in silence, escalate the problem to distribution. Occasionally we hear people saying, well, I think it's the DCP, but they've not necessarily done anything about it. They assume it's the DCP, I have no control over this. But speak to the distributors, you know, you'll do it with equipment manufacturers, so, you know, do it with content providers in the same way. And at the end of the day, we all know this, it's why we're here. Customers deserve an outstanding 3D presentation. It's something we want to deliver, and in most cases it can be delivered very well, so we've got a duty to try and do that. So that's what I would advocate there. So I'm going to hand back over to Richard now for our Q&A session. So over to you, Mr. Mitchell.
Thanks, Matt. So the Q&A section is now open, so if you have any questions, I can see some have come in already, please feel free to ask them and we'll hopefully try and answer as many as possible. Matt, we've had a question in saying, my movie content seems okay, but I have problems continuously with subtitling. Is this common?
Okay, yeah, I can answer that one. Yeah, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I have sometimes seen out in the field, it's not the most common problem, but sometimes there have been cases I've seen where the movie content appears good, but the foreign subtitles are actually ghosting themselves, but not the movie. So sometimes I find even a particular movie is working very fine in particular territories with subtitles, but in another territory, its subtitles are ghosting. And this is sometimes a case of how subtitles are mastered onto DCPs in, should we call it post-production? That's when that's added on. So again, I would talk to your individual content provider that's provided that particular DCP and highlight the problem. It may be something that can be corrected with another DCP sent out.
Okay, another question. Have you experienced any ghosting problems related to video server settings?
Video server settings. I can't say I have personally myself, no.
Okay, we have another question here. How can I measure the ghosting on a screen? Do you have a test DCP for this?
Oh, yeah, good question. I mean, as I've mentioned in the webinar already, Always I prefer the best test of all in some respects is using different DCPs of movie content itself. That said, a lot can be gleaned from using crosstalk test patterns, and although Harkness don't provide them ourselves, the majority of the 3D system manufacturers do provide these. So to talk to your 3D provider and they will be able to send you these crosstalk patterns, and they're very good for a quick reference. And I know I can think of off the top of my head at least 3 companies that can do this. So certainly speak with your 3D provider.
Okay, there's 2 questions have come together, so I'll try and combine them for you, Matt. The question is there a typical type of 3D movie content that's more prone to ghosting than others? And the other similar question is animated 3D content with a wide depth field of view prone to 3D ghosting?
Yeah, I see why you see those both linked. Yeah, definitely. Again, there's lots of change, lots of differences in how the content is mastered itself. So there's lots of things we may not be aware of, but certainly shall we call it the depth of 3D? The deeper the 3D is, the more chance there is actually of ghosting. So sometimes when I'm testing ghosting and I want to prove something very easily, I'll actually test on a very low depth 3D DCP, meaning if there's even a slight problem, this will work fine. The deeper the 3D, the more chances there is of an issue. So very deep scenes, also sometimes very fast moving scenes will pick it up as well.
Okay, another question here. It says, can ghosting be caused by using one 3D system with another manufacturer's glasses?
In polarized 3D systems, I have to say I've not personally seen that myself. I couldn't say for certain it's not the case, but I've seen many instances, and I've used myself, where I've used different manufacturers' glasses and not seen a problem. That said, 3D eyewear is not all the same, and the filters in the eyewear can be made to different qualities. So it's not necessarily one manufacturer's versus another, but it's different grades and how good they are. So it may be a case that someone's using the prescribed manufacturer's glasses and then somebody uses perhaps a very cheap mass-produced alternative that might not be quite as good, might introduce a ghost that wouldn't normally be there. So I suppose, yes, that could be the case.
Okay, another question. How often do passive polarized filters cause issues due to orientation? Are circular better than linear?
Well, most of the ones out there are circular, but we actually see out there.
Okay, another question, Matt. What's the impact of the projection window glass?
Yeah, the projection window glass, the port glass we're referring to, which I mentioned in the slide. Obviously, we need to have that port glass for obvious reasons, but if it's the correct type of glass, it should cause no problem itself. But certain glass has different sorts of filters in. The example I used was to do with fire retardant glass, and the internal reflections that this can sometimes cause can actually depolarize the image. So the image will be polarized once it hits the glass, but once it exits the glass, it's lost polarity before it's even hit the screen. So that can have a very detrimental effect. But as I mentioned in the webinar, if you want to prove this, to check your glass isn't causing the problem, do remove the glass itself. If that's not possible, I do know that certain of the 3D providers do also have certain testing procedures for testing the glass whilst it's in situ. So that's something, again, that's worth checking with your 3D provider.
Okay, another question. Matt, can ghosting be embedded into the content, e.g. the left eye image or the right eye image, or is it just the content makes ghosting already present in the system more visible if it's got higher contrast or brightness?
Yes, sorry, can you just read that one more time, Richard? Sorry.
Can ghosting be embedded in the content, e.g. in the left eye image or the right eye image, or is it just the content makes ghosting already present in the system more visible?
Yeah, I would say the latter, that by the very nature of 3D polarized systems, there is always some form of ghost, but if it's done correctly, it's so minimal and it's not discernible to the audience. So there can be problems there that will just magnify that issue itself, so it's the latter.
Okay, another question here with regards to auditorium geometry. Is the position of the projector to the screen sometimes an issue?
I would say it can be if it's extreme, but that's not usually the case. But what you might find is, particularly with dual beam 3D systems, that dual 3D dual beam 3D systems or triple beam 3D systems will usually have a ratio that they can project at. So there might be different models for different projection throws versus screen size, essentially screen ratios. So if you do have the wrong system that doesn't quite match your auditorium, that itself can introduce a ghost compared to what would be there from a regular system, the correct system, should I say.
Okay, a few more, Matt. How about dirt and dust on the screen? Can that affect ghosting?
I've not actually attributed that myself. I would say in an extreme example, if the screen was absolutely and utterly thickly covered in dust, of course that would obscure the metal flake of the screen. That could introduce ghosting for sure. But I have to say I've personally not come across that myself. But in theory, yes, it's possible.
Okay, similar question with regards to the screen. Does the coating of a silver screen degrade over time and lose polarization and increase ghosting? If so, how quick?
Yeah, I would say, and obviously I can speak for only Harkness screens here, of course. Our screens don't really lose polarity over time, and we would sort of say perhaps 10-year life of a screen. But I would say, and it's almost linked to the previous question, that the quality of the screen, the coating, so whether we're talking about 3D ghosting, although I would say it'd be in an extreme situation there, but even talking about light levels and screen gain, it's going to be down to the environmental conditions of the theatre. So for example, if there's a motorway or a building site just outside the cinema, then you can get lots of dust and things coming in through the intake. Equally, we see some certain bad practices where people cleaning the cinemas are using like leaf blowers, and they're blowing all the rubbish to the edge of the seating area before sweeping it up. Now, of course, this blows all of the dust around the cinema, and a lot of the dust is popcorn dust. So, of course, this leaves oil on the screen, so this can cause problems and degrade the screen over time. But again, I've not personally seen this attributed to ghosting. I really haven't, but it can lead to other problems.
Okay, Matt, and finally, we'll take one last question. We've got quite a lot still in here, but we'll answer those offline afterwards. There was a question here, again regarding the auditorium, which was, is ghosting more prevalent if you are to one side of the auditorium looking at the screen?
Yeah, in theory, you could say yes, because as you move off axis in an auditorium, the signal to noise ratio, the crosstalk level that you'll be actually viewing from where you're sitting would actually be a lower value than it would be if you're on the central axis. That said, and I've done this test many times myself, I've moved, certainly on our screens, I've moved off axis to the edge of the screen, and also I like to move to what I call the challenging seats at the very front left or very front right at the auditorium. And although it's not a seat I would particularly want to look at, when you have a good quality screen and a good quality 3D setup, the polarization is still working. But for sure, it will be degrading in the very extreme angles.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Matt. Thank you for all those questions. I think there's something like another 30 or 40 that we haven't actually had a time to cover. I guess it's one of those subjects we could possibly talk about for an awful lot of time. So next steps, well, Harkness are going to continue investigating 3D ghosting with a view to making some more technical recommendations and statements in the coming months. We're looking into conducting some further research to better educate the industry as to how we can identify ghosting and some of the remedies that may well be possible to eliminate this interference in the visual experience. Of course, when you signed up, you were notified that there would be a white paper detailing the testing process Matt outlined today. That white paper will be sent to you within the next 2 to 3 days once we have finalised everything to do with today. There is hopefully a recording of today's web seminar which will be available in due course once we've processed that. Of course, with CinemaCon just under 2 weeks away, we will be there in force, Matt and myself, along with the rest of our team from Harkness, so you can visit us at booth 2203A, which is in the Augustus Ballroom. Of course, do visit our website for further information, And please do feel free to reach out to Tony, Dennis, Anthony, Pritam, Alan, Shram, Matt, Cody or myself, or your local Harkness representative, which might be an integrator, if you require some further information. It just leaves me to thank you all for your time this afternoon, and on behalf of Matt, myself and everybody at Harkness, we wish you a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.